Good morning, everyone. It's good to share this time with you virtually. Who would have thought 6 months ago that we would be having OCDA this way? We were looking forward to the usual face-to-face gatherings. Today, we're going to look at leadership in challenging times. And this picture, first slide, shows people doing something which I would personally find challenging. You will never find me trying to climb a mountain. They are literally climbing a mountain, and in many respects, we are now figuratively climbing a mountain. Next slide, and thanks to Brandon for being my tech assistant today. Keep this in mind as we start. Blessed are the flexible, for they shall not be bent out of shape. That's a little play on Beatitudes, as you know, and we've all had to be very flexible. So let me start off with thanking Brandon, first of all, for being so flexible with the conference committee that they were able to switch from all of their plans in person to being online. I think that's terrific. That's a great sign of flexibility. Another sign is our ability to work with Zoom, although this morning my screen sharing wasn't so successful, so I'm not sure how flexible I am. You might ask, well, what choice did we have about all this Zooming and everything else? We could have just sort of dug our heels in and said, nope, we're not going to do this. But really, waiting for life to return back to normal would be futile because it's not going to. There will be some kind of a new normal. We don't know exactly what that'll be like, but we're getting a few more glimpses of that, I think. But certainly now we have much more information and we have many more resources than we had May 5th, which was the date of that first webinar that ACDA and NATS and Choral Chorus America and the Barbershop Organization co-sponsored. The responses to that webinar were interesting to me. They ranged from grief to anger to disbelief to hope. If you heard Tim Sharp, our executive director of ACDA, say at the end, let's focus on what we can do. There was some hope in that. In addition to hearing that glimpse, we also heard a lot of facts that were very jarring, but they were helpful. It's important to know the science. There's a time when we have to balance that data of science with the heart of artistry and the deeply human desire to be together through music. So we know we can't resume our activities exactly as we did before, but we will get back together. We may have to think about masks and spacing and ventilation and the length of time we can be together and whether we should be outside or inside and do we have enough masks and do we need mics? There are all kinds of things we need to think about. Next slide, please. Just shortly after that webinar, Kelly Walsh, who's the Choral Canada president, posted this. If a choir is only about singing and performing, there will be no choir for a while. If choir is about teaching and learning, growing, connecting, community, cultural exploration and transmission, and innovating, we will find a way to have choir. The key point, I think, in Kelly's statement is that choir or choral music is not just about performance. It's about the product, and we know that. Look at the number of students for whom the choir room, the band room, the orchestra room, the jazz band rehearsal space, show choir, that's their safe space, and it's their sort of favorite place to be. Think about the 75-year-olds who come to church choir on Wednesday or Thursday night. They're not there to exercise their lungs as much as they are to exercise their friendships, and in the case of the worship settings, their spirituality. It's been so interesting to read what students have said about what they missed when the school year ended so abruptly. They missed being together. They missed seeing their friends. They missed making music together. They missed that experience of community. But there are ways that we can be together even apart, and lots of you have worked really hard at Zoom to edit virtual choir activities. You've used it as a means of getting your groups together, whether it was to do mini rehearsals or just give them time and space to check in with each other. Next slide. In mid-May, I watched a really interesting presentation by Reverend Dr. Nola Krause of the Moravian Music Foundation. And she said this, and if you'll just go on the next, she was talking about creating community when we can't be together musically through working together in food banks and other volunteer opportunities. And we certainly know that when we see those huge lines of people waiting for produce distribution and so forth, that works because so many people in the community are volunteering to be there to help out. It's almost a depression-like environment. I'm not old enough to have lived then, but I did have grandparents and parents who talked about it. Let's go to the next entry there. What about musical connection? I'd add my own ideas to this. If you want to stay in the musical realm, what about porch concerts? With safe physical distancing, you can do this with a small group. There are lots of ways. Get on your balcony and sing like all those Italians did and all the people in New York. That was pretty exciting. Let's go to the next slide. What we're really having to emphasize now is process versus product. And these next two phrases that we're going to put up here are really saying the same thing. We're thinking about the how versus what, and we're thinking about actions versus outcomes. There are no choral concerts, for example, at the University of Toronto this fall. How could there be? There are many schools that are in the same position. We don't have Allstate in Ohio. That was canceled as of May 11th, but it was the safe thing to do. Will we have it eventually? I think so. It may be 2022, but I think it will come back. I prefer to be an optimist. Let's go to the next slide. What are our current leadership challenges and how are we responding? Well, here they are. First of all, we have to find and use new leadership skills. And second, we are leading in a new landscape. And obviously these two things are connected. And many people are learning how to edit virtual choir presentations and finding that it's extremely time consuming and it doesn't replace the real thing. But it's an interesting project. Some people are using the time to work on students' musicianship skills. I have a Canadian colleague who does Zoom meetings with her community choir, and she's looked at warm-ups and she's done things to help them with their vocal skills so they can practice when they're not together. Other people are doing mini rehearsals. In religious choral communities, sometimes it's about using time to study texts and looking ahead to what they might do in the sort of post-vaccine future. And some are just using it again to check in. Next slide. Resources. I've divided these into two, and I know there are many others, but first of all, the two webinars that we had with these combined groups, let's put that up there. I mentioned the May 5th one, just the facts, and that was the jarring one. And then May 26th, the follow-up, what can we do? I think people were much more encouraged about that because we began to see what kinds of resources are available. And I've just listed a few of them here. If you go to the next, right. So Choirs Unite is a group that's coordinated by Marion Dolan. She's just meticulous about sharing information. It's on Facebook. Music Service Learning, Marcy Major, who's a doctoral graduate from the Ohio State University. She teaches at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. She got together with Apfelstadt Books and they produced a series of free resources which involved their senior music ed students and their student teachers. It's wonderful stuff, and I was astounded at how quickly they did that. Lesson plans, videos where, say, a trumpet major can help that 8th grader with some problems that they're having. Professional Choral Collective, this is the brainchild of Derek Fox. And this is very specific teaching ideas for middle school and high school teachers. He's gathered a group together who are constantly providing resources. Then next, we have My Choral Coach, which is an ACDA GIA project, online rehearsal aid. There are webinars, June 24th, 25th, and 26th, if you go to the ACDA website, that will help you learn to use this platform. It's not expensive, and for $50, 6 months membership, and it's for your singers. Then the Western region ACDA has a task force in innovation. They've had some wonderful webinars and they have just put out some materials, I believe, on June 17th or 18th, which you can also find on the ACDA website. And finally, one that I think is just extremely useful, the ACDA National COVID-19 document, if you go back one, Brandon, there we go, was released on June 15th, and Ohio's own Robin Lano was one of the contributors to that. It is such a specific document geared to middle school, high school, worship, music leaders. It bases its suggestions on 3 scenarios, any one of which you might face in the fall. Complete face-to-face, that might be a dream, but what would you do if we were having actual real-time instruction, a hybrid kind of instruction, or all online? I've shared that with some of my Canadian church friends who say that it is extremely useful and a big time saver. Okay, next slide. Sadly, it's not just COVID-19 that's going on that's challenging our leadership right now, but there's a triple threat. So we have 3 things going on. We have the pandemic, which is first. We have the economic fallout of that. We've got millions of people in the United States who are out of work, and some of those jobs are not going to come back. And then the third thing was the horrible murder of George Floyd, which really, if you go to the next slide, what that served to do was to lead to a national outcry, which became international. We've seen the rallies and the protests in England, in France, all over the world now. Next point there, Brandon. That murder became the catalyst against racial injustice, social inequity, and it also made us very much aware of white privilege. And I certainly can take ownership of that. So what do we have to do? Let's move to the next slide. Here are some professional responses to this, which I think are very helpful. One of the things about white privilege is that we really have to think about our programming. And MSVMA on June 1st indicated that they had purged their repertoire lists of music that demean African Americans. They took out all the minstrel songs, and other states have done the same thing since then. In addition to that, there's a really interesting organization, the Institute for Composer Diversity at SUNY Fredonia, which challenges us to program 50% female composers and 50% minority composers. Now, they say that's aspirational, but even if we challenge ourselves to make it 20% or 30% or start with 10, what a good idea that is. You can track that down through SUNY Fredonia. They have resource lists. Very, very helpful. And finally, a third one that I came across, and many of you are likely aware of, is Marcus Garrett's document on non-idiomatic music of Black composers. This is a wonderful document that has so many resources that if you do set yourself a goal of programming more music by African American composers, you can find various types of music here. Let's go to the next slide. I know I need to work on my programming when I'm doing guest conducting. I was brought up in a conservatory environment, and it was very Western art music. Let's focus now on the specific leadership qualities that will serve us all well. Last summer I presented at a conference in Nova Scotia, which is where I grew up. It was for women conductors, and I brought to them some information I had gotten from, of all places, a Canadian government website, Innovation, Science, and Economic Development. I often look in business and outside of music for indicators of what leadership can mean, because I find they're very applicable. So the first characteristic on this website is conviction. As leaders, we have to have conviction about what we're doing. We've got to be passionate about the music and about its role in society. I think there's no shortage of passion. Now we're being called upon more than ever to advocate for our art. It's not going to disappear on our watch. You've probably read about Randolph School District in Greater Boston, where K through 12, all arts, visual arts, musical arts, and PE have been cut for the year. Let's not let that happen in Ohio. I'm sure with your conviction, it's not going to. The second characteristic or quality of leadership is vision. Thinking ahead to the future, daring to dream about new ways of doing things. Now we really have to. In some respects, we've been forced to do that. The third one is communication. This is something where we have to be very skilled at sharing our ideas with other people, inviting their involvement, listening, lots of listening, and transparency, which is so important in terms of open and honest communication. Now is the time to pool our resources, not to focus on self-advancement or turf building. And when we can't be together in person, we have to use these other platforms. Who knew about Zoom before the pandemic? We're all Zoomers now. Fourth one, delegation. This is one that I think is important, pandemic or no. We have to find people to help us. We are a community. Some of the tasks that are unfamiliar or hard for us, other people can do. We find those people, we empower them to use their skills, and then we get out of their way and let them do it. So if you're not a video editor, but you want to do a virtual choir, somebody in your community knows how to do that or can lead you to someone who does. So don't be stingy with your opportunity giving. Give that opportunity to somebody else. Number 5 is flexibility. That's where we started. Blessed are the flexible. It's a key component of good leadership because we have to adjust to change. We have to respond to different needs of the group or the individual. And when we rise to that challenge of the changing artistic and societal needs now, that allows us to be very nimble and responsive. The current term is pivot. I'm not a big fan of buzzwords, but that word is accurate and clear. We have to pivot. And finally, it's vital that we show appreciation to people that we work with and let them know they're valued. Especially in our field, we can't function in a vacuum. Who makes music without singers in front of them as a conductor? And there are multiple ways that we can do this. We can listen to people's concerns, we can give public accolades as they're deserved, and so on. There's such a good spirit of gratitude and support evident now in many of the social media sites. I love that. Keep it up. Let's go to the next slide. Further into that website, same Canadian government website, I found 7 suggestions for developing leadership skills. And I'm just going to highlight these and then talk about how they pertain to choral conducting. Because believe me, the people who put this list together were not thinking about musicians, but they're so practical. So the first one is to understand the importance of leadership. And to me, this means that we have to keep in mind the different roles that we have and the balance of them. We are scholars, musicians, teachers, we are leaders. We may feel more like counselors now, but our jobs are much, much bigger than teaching people how to be better musicians. When I first started teaching, that was what I had been taught to do. I was not taught to think about people first. I was taught to think about music first. Second one, very important, is to know our own weaknesses and strengths. We have to be honest with ourselves about this, and it's all right to ask for help in those areas where we don't feel so confident. And with a new landscape that we're facing now, that is more than ever important. And we're so fortunate to have many resources and many helpful colleagues. The third one is implementing coaching. Seek a mentor or a sponsor. Oftentimes a mentor is somebody older, but in these days where we have a new set of skills, I find oftentimes it's younger people who may have those tech skills that we oldsters don't have. They have better social media skills. We need to rely on people like that. But going outside of ourselves to get the help we need, very important. The fourth one is to be transparent, be honest and vulnerable. And this relates to the previous slide, I think. If you want to know more about vulnerability, check out the work of Brene Brown. She's at University of Arizona, I believe, and she writes very extensively about vulnerability and leadership. Number 5, earn respect, not love or fear. This comes from knowing our field, leading with kindness, and not being intimidating. Enough said. The next one is like appreciation that we discussed before. Reward people. Encouragement is such a part of good leadership. Remember that saying, I think my grandmother used to say it, that you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And encouragement is a sign of good leadership. And finally, networking, which is what you are good at because you're members of ACDA and OCDA. Be active in these professional organizations. This is where connections are so important to us. We are a community of helpful, resourceful, nimble people. Look how fast the OCDA board made that shift. They pivoted, thank you, Brandon, to this online format. Next slide. Here we are back to mountain climbing. In the middle of May, I was looking on LinkedIn and I came across an article by Rachel Botsman. She is a British businesswoman who is very much a believer in trust in the workplace. And she says, I'm fascinated by how trust enables us to navigate uncertainty, place our faith in people, and take leaps into the unknown. You've probably all been on those leadership conferences where you have to fall back in the arms of multiple people, and they're doing that obviously to teach us how to trust the people behind us. If I were the third person in this line going up this mountain, this is a hypothetical, you understand, I would want to know that the people ahead of me were trustworthy. I'd want to be able to trust that my pole was going to help give me a grip, that my cleats on my boots were going to stick into the ice, that I was warm enough, that my goggles would protect my eyesight. I would really need to trust. And we need, as a group, to trust each other. Let's move on. Next slide. In the same article, Rachel Botsman noted some characteristics of female world leadership in the pandemic. She was writing about people like Angela Merkel of Germany, Lucinda Ardern of New Zealand, and Mette Frederiksen of Denmark, among others. She said that women are often thought to have more empathy than men, but what she found true amongst these political leaders was 4 characteristics, and here they are. They all start with the word C. Clarity is the first, then competence, then she talks about compassion, and the final one is consistency. Now, some days right now we may not feel we have a lot of clarity or competence, but we always know we have compassion. Musicians are compassionate people, and we are, as disciplined musicians, quite consistent as a general rule. Regardless of gender, and I continue to believe in all of my reading about leadership that it is not gender dependent, these elements of leadership are important to all of us, especially in this time. Let's look at one more entrance on this slide. Through those characteristics of clarity, competence, compassion, and consistency, these leaders have engendered trust. Let's move to the next one. Leadership in Turbulent Times is the title of a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's an American historian, and she writes about presidential leadership. She writes in this book, and we can just show the tag here, about 4 presidents, and she offers 10 lessons about leadership. She's looking at Lincoln, Johnson, Teddy Roosevelt, and FDR. And after she goes through the 10 points of leadership, which you can find on any of her webinars or her TED Talks, she says this. Here's the second point. Humility and empathy are essential for good leadership. So we have to take our ego out of it, and we have to be empathic to others to be successful. And finally, coming back to Ohio, our own Amy Acton often said in her press conferences with the governor, we are all in this together. Our singers, remember, are just as distressed as we are. We have to keep their needs in mind and show empathy. And that characteristic is very much needed today with everything we've got going on. I think we need to pay attention to science. I admit the amount of science that we get is sometimes both too much and too little. It's not necessarily telling us what we want to hear yet, but is it worth taking the chance of jumping out and saying, we're just going to give it a go and see what happens? Personally, I think not, particularly if the groups that you work with have older singers in them. If it's a community choir or a church volunteer choir, no. Our minister at church recently said, I love you too much to risk your health. Once we have an effective vaccine that was widely distributed, I think we are going to be able to resume group activities more the way that we're used to in our our comfort zone. They still may be modified, but we are creative, we have conviction of will, and we have patience where we need to. And we're going to be able to make things work musically and personally. I firmly believe that. And I think that in the new landscape, if we're more respectful than ever of the human elements in our art, so much the better. We have at least two compelling forces in society right now moving us in that direction, one being COVID-19 and the other being social injustice. We have many resources to fall back on, and those are going to enable us to lead in challenging times. I want to leave you with one thought from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who lived a long time ago. Let's go to the next slide. And here's what he said. Do not follow where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. Forge ahead, climb your mountains, you will succeed. I hope you have a wonderful virtual conference. I want to acknowledge that there are people here from other states and even from Canada. I think that's very exciting. And thanks again to Brandon and his committee for working so hard to adjust with the times. That I think is great leadership. And on a personal note of privilege, Brandon, thank you for recording this so that I can pivot to being a home healthcare worker and take care of my husband after his surgery. Thank you.